Volume 2, Chapter 8 of The Vicar of Wrexhill. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. The Vicar of Wrexhill by Francis Milton Trollope. Volume 2, Chapter 8. Charles's Sorrow. Mrs. Simpson in her new character. The Vicar's proceedings discussed. The two gentlemen found the family at the Park very sociably seated round a late breakfast table. Helen, Rosalind, and Charles, before they broke up their conclave in the library the night before, or rather that morning, had all decided that in the present thorny and difficult position of affairs, it was equally their duty and interest to propitiate the kind feelings of Mrs. Mowbray by every means in their power, and draw her thereby, if possible, from the mischievous and insidious influence of her new associates. "It is hardly possible to believe," said Charles, "that my mother can really prefer the society of such an animal as this methodistical attorney to that of her own family, or of those neighbours and friends from whom, since my father's death, she has so completely withdrawn herself. It is very natural she should be out of spirits, poor dear soul, and Mr. Cartwright is just the sort of person to obtain influence at such a time. But I trust this will wear off again. She will soon get sick of this solemn attorney, and we shall all be as happy again as ever." "Heaven grant it!" said Helen with a sigh. "Heaven grant it!" echoed Rosalind with another. It was in consequence of this resolution that the trio continued to sit at the table much longer than usual, exerting themselves to amuse Mrs. Mowbray, to win from Fanny one of her former bright smiles, and even to make Miss Cartwright sociable. Their efforts were not wholly unsuccessful. There was a genuine animation and vivacity about Charles that seemed irresistible. Mrs. Mowbray looked at him with a mother's eye. Miss Cartwright forsook her monosyllables, and almost conversed; and Fanny, while listening first to Helen and then to her brother, forgot her duty as a professing Christian as far as to let a whole ringlet of her sunny hair get loose from behind her ear, and not notice it. In the midst of this gleam of sunshine the door opened, and Mr. Cartwright and Mr. Corbold were announced. Ambitious of producing effect, as both these serious gentlemen certainly were, they could hardly have hoped, when their spirits were most exalted within them, to have caused a more remarkable revolution in the state of things than their appearance now produced. Mrs. Mowbray coloured, half rose from her chair, sat down again, and finally exclaimed, "Oh, Mr. Cartwright!" in a tone of voice that manifested almost every feeling he could wish to inspire. Fanny, who was in the very act of smiling when the door opened, immediately became conscious that her hair was out of order, and that her whole attitude and manner were wanting in that Christian grace and sobriety which had been of late her chiefest glory. Such Christian grace and sobriety, however, as she had lately learned, poor child, are not difficult to assume, or long in putting on, so that before her minister had completed his little prayer and thanksgiving in the ear of her mother, for her eternal happiness and her safe return, Fanny was quite in proper trim to meet his eye and receive his blessing. Henrietta at once fell back into her wonted heavy silent gloom, like a leaden statue upon which the sun, shining for a moment, had thrown the hue of silver. Charles stood up and saluted the vicar civilly but coldly, while to his companion's low bow he returned a slight and stiff inclination of the head. It should be observed that during the few days which intervened between the arrival of Charles and the return of his mother, the vicar had greatly relaxed in his attentions to Fanny, and indeed altogether in the frequency of his pastoral visitations at the Park. He had explained this in the ear of his pretty proselyte by telling her that he was much engaged in pushing forward the work of regeneration in his parish, to the which holy labour he was the more urgently incited by perceiving that the seed was not thrown upon barren ground. Nor indeed was this statement wholly untrue. He had taken advantage of the leisure which the present posture of affairs at the Park left upon his hands in seeking to inflame the imaginations of as many of his parishioners as he could get to listen to him. Among the females he had been particularly successful, and indeed the proportion of the fair sex who are found to embrace the tenets which this gentleman and his sect have introduced in place of those of the Church of England is so great, that as their faith is an exclusive one, it might be conjectured that the chief object of the doctrine was to act as a balance weight against that of Mahomet, who, atrocious tyrant as he was, shut the gates of heaven against all womankind whatsoever. Were it not that an occasional nest of he-saints may here and there be found, sometimes in a drum-profaned barrack, and sometimes in a cloistered college, which shows that election is not wholly confined to the fair. There are, however, some very active and inquiring persons who assert that upon a fair and accurate survey throughout England and Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and the town of Berwick upon Tweed, no greater number of this sect can be found of the masculine gender than may suffice to perform the duties of ministers, deputy ministers, missionaries, assistant missionaries, speech makers, both in and out of Parliament, committee men, and such serious footmen, coachmen, butchers, and bakers as the fair inhabitants of the Calvinistic heaven require to perform the unfeminine drudgery of earth. It was in consequence of this remission in the vicar's labours for the regeneration of Fanny, that Charles Mowbray still treated him with the respect due to the clergyman of his parish. Rosalind felt it quite impossible to describe to him all that she had seen, and her promise to Henrietta forbade her to repeat what she had heard; so that young Mowbray, though he disapproved of the puritanic innovations of Fanny's toilette, and so much disliked Mr. Cartwright's extempore preaching as to have decided upon attending divine service at Oakley Church for the future, to avoid hearing what he considered as so very indecent an innovation, he was still quite unaware of Rosalind's real motives for recalling him, though extremely well inclined to think her right in having done so. Miss Torrington and Helen left the room very soon after the two gentlemen entered it. Henrietta, with the stealthy step of a cat, followed them, and young Mowbray felt strongly tempted to do the like, but was prevented, not so much by politeness perhaps, as by curiosity to ascertain, if possible, the terms on which both these gentlemen stood with his mother. But it was not possible. As long as he remained with them, the very scanty conversation which took place was wholly on uninteresting subjects, and Charles at length left the room, from feeling that it was not his mother's pleasure to talk to the attorney of the business that he presumed must have brought him there, as long as he remained in it. There is in the domestic history of human life no cause productive of effects so terrible as the habit of acting according to the impulse or the convenience of the moment, without fully considering the effect what we are doing may produce on others. Mrs. Mowbray, in waiting till Charles left the room before she spake to Mr. Corbold of the title deeds and other papers which she was to put into his hands, was almost wholly actuated by the consciousness that the attorney she was employing, though a serious, was a very vulgar man. She knew that her son was rather fastidious on such points, and she disliked the idea that a man, whose distinguished piety rendered him so peculiarly eligible as a man of business, should, at his first introduction to the confidential situation she intended he should hold, lay himself open to the ridicule of a youth who, she sighed to think, was as yet quite incapable of appreciating his merit in any way. If any secondary motive mixed with this, it arose from the averseness she felt, of which she was not herself above half conscious, that any one should hear advice given by Mr. Cartwright who might think themselves at liberty to question it. But with all this, she never dreamed of the pain she was giving to Charles's heart. She dreamed not that her son, her only son, with a heart as warm, as generous, as devoted in its filial love as ever beat in the breast of man, felt all his ardent affection for her, his proud fond wish of being her protector, her aid, her confidential friend, now checked and chilled at once and for ever. This consequence of her cold, restrained manner in his presence was so natural, in fact so inevitable, that had she turned her eyes from herself and her own little unimportant feelings to what might be their effect upon his, it is hardly possible that she could have avoided catching some glimpse of the danger she ran, and much after misery might have been spared. As it was, she felt a movement of unequivocal satisfaction when he departed, and having told Fanny to join the other young ladies while she transacted business, she was left alone with the two gentlemen, and in a few minutes afterwards the contents of her late husband's strong box, consisting of parchments, memoranda, and deeds almost innumerable, overspread the large table, as well as every sofa and chair within convenient reach. The two serious gentlemen smiled, but it was inwardly. Their eyes ran over the inscription of every precious packet, and if those of the professional man caught more rapidly at a glance the respective importance of each, the vicar had the advantage of him in that prophetic feeling of their future importance to himself, which rendered the present hour one of the happiest of his life. Meanwhile, Charles sought Helen and her friend. Far, however, from wishing to impart to them the painful impression he had received, his principal object in immediately seeking them was, if possible, to forget it. He found the four girls together in the conservatory, and, affecting more gaiety than he felt, exclaimed, "How many recruits shall I get among you to join me in a walk to Wrexhill? 1, 2, 3, 4. That's delightful. Make haste, bonnet and veil yourselves without delay, and if we skirt round the plantations to the lodge, we shall escape being broiled, for the lanes are always shady." When he had got his convoy fairly under way, they began to make inquiries as to what he was going to do at Wrexhill. "I will tell you," he replied, "if you will promise not to run away and forsake me." They pledged themselves to be faithful to their escort, and he then informed them that it was his very particular wish and desire to pay sundry visits to the beau monde of Wrexhill. "It is treason to the milliner not to have told us so before, Charles," said Helen. "Only look at poor Fanny's little straw bonnet, without even a bow to set it off. What will Mrs. Simpson think of us?" "I assure you, Helen," said Fanny, "that if I had known we were going to visit all the fine people in the county, I should have put on no other bonnet. And as for Mrs. Simpson, I believe you are quite mistaken in supposing she would object to it. I hope she has seen the error of her ways, as well as I have, Charles, and that we shall never more see her dressed like a heathenish woman, as she used to do." "Oh, Fanny, Fanny!" exclaimed Charles, laughing, "how long will this spirit vex you?" Fortunately, however, for the harmony of the excursion, none of the party appeared at this moment inclined to controversy, and the subject dropped. Instead, therefore, of talking of different modes of faith, and of the bonnets thereunto belonging, the conversation turned upon the peculiar beauty of the woodland scenery around Wrexhill, and Miss Cartwright, as almost a stranger, was applied to for her opinion of it. "I believe I am a very indifferent judge of scenery," she replied. "The fact is, I never see it." "Do you not see it now?" said Rosalind. "Do you not see that beautiful stretch of park-like common, with its tufts of holly, its rich grapes of forest trees, with their dark heavy drapery of leaves, relieved by the light and wavy gracefulness of the delicate and silvery birch? And loveliest of all, do you not see that stately avenue of oaks, the turf under them green in eternal shade, and the long perspective looking like the nave of some gigantic church?" Rosalind stood still as she spoke, and Henrietta remained beside her. They were descending the bit of steep road which, passing behind the church and the vicarage, led into the village street of Wrexhill, and the scene described by Miss Torrington was at this point completely given to their view. Henrietta put her arm within that of Rosalind with a degree of familiarity very unusual with her, and having gazed on the fair expanse before her for several minutes, she replied, "Yes, Rosalind, I do see it now, and I thank you for making it visible to me. Perhaps in future, when I may perchance be thinking of you, I may see it again." Rosalind turned to seek her meaning in her face, and saw that her dark deep-set eyes were full of tears. This was so unexpected, so unprecedented, so totally unlike any feeling she had ever remarked in her before, that Rosalind was deeply touched by it, and pressing the arm that rested on hers, she said, "Dear Henrietta, why are you so averse to letting one understand what passes in your heart? It is only by an accidental breath, which now and then lifts the veil you hang before it, that one can even find out that you have any heart at all. Did you know all the darkness that dwells there, you would not thank me for showing it to you." Having said this, she stepped hastily forward, and drawing on Rosalind, who would have lingered with her, till they had overtaken the others, they all turned from the lane into the village street together. They had not proceeded 100 yards before they were met by a dozen rosy and riotous children returning from dinner to school. At the sight of the Mowbray party, every boy uncapped, and every little girl made her best courtesy, but one unlucky wag, whose eyes unfortunately fixed themselves on Fanny, being struck by the precision of her little bonnet, straight hair, and the total absence of frill, furbelow, or any other indication of worldly mindedness, restrained his bounding steps for a moment, and pursing up his little features into a look of sanctity, exclaimed, "Amen!" and then, terrified at what he had done, galloped away and hid himself among his fellows. Fanny coloured, but immediately assumed the resigned look that announceth martyrdom. Charles laughed, though he turned round and shook his switch at the saucy offender. Helen looked vexed, Rosalind amused, and Henrietta very nearly delighted. A few minutes more brought them to the door of Mrs. Simpson. Their inquiry for the lady was answered by the information that she "was schooling, miss, but if they would be pleased to walk in, she would come down directly." They accordingly entered the drawing room, where they were kept waiting for some time, which was indeed pretty generally the fate of morning visitors to Mrs. Simpson. The interval was employed as the collectors of albums and annuals intend all intervals should be, namely, in the examination of all the morocco-bound volumes deposited on the grand round table in the middle of the room, and on all the square, oblong, octagon, and oval minor tables in the various nooks and corners of it. On the present occasion they seemed to promise more amusement than usual to the party, who had most of them been frequently there before, for they were nearly all new. Poor little Fanny, though she knew that not one of those with her were capable of enjoying the intellectual and edifying feast that almost the first glance of her eye showed her was set before them, could not restrain an exclamation of "Oh, how heavenly minded!" The whole collection, indeed, which though recently and hastily formed had evidently been brought together by the hand of a master of such matters, was not only most strictly evangelical, but most evangelically ingenious. Helen, however, appeared to find food neither for pleasantry nor edification there, for having opened one or two slender volumes, and as many heavy pamphlets, she abandoned the occupation with a sigh that spoke sadness and vexation. Miss Cartwright, who had seated herself on the same sofa, finished her examination still more quickly, saying in a low voice as she settled herself in a well-pillowed corner, "Surfeit is the father of much fast." Miss Torrington and young Mowbray got hold of by far the finest volume of all, whose gilt leaves and silken linings showed that it was intended as the repository of the most precious gifts that, according to the frontispiece, genius could offer to friendship. Having given a glance at his contents, Charles drew out his pencil, and on the blank side of a letter wrote the following catalogue of them, which, though imperfect as not naming them all, was most scrupulously correct as far as it went. St. Paul's Head, sketched in pen and ink. Here's the Bower, to words of grace. The deathbed talk of Master Blink. Lines on a fallen maiden's case. Sonnet upon heavenly love. A pencil drawing of St. Peter. Emblems, the pigeon and the dove. Gray's Odes, turned to psalm tune metre. A Christian ode in praise of tea, freely translated from Redi. He had just presented the scrap to Rosalind when Mrs. Simpson entered, leading her little girl in her hand. But the young lady had leisure to convey it unnoticed to her pocket, as the mistress of the house had for the first few minutes eyes only for Fanny. In fact, she literally ran to her the instant she perceived her little bonnet, and folding her arms round her, exclaimed, "My dear, dear child, my dear, dear sister, this is providential. It is a blessing I shall remember always. Our minister told me I should read at a glance the blessed change wrought upon you. I do read it, and I will rejoice therefore. I beg your pardon, ladies. Mr. Mowbray, pray sit down. I beg your pardon. I rejoice to see you, though as yet—" Her eyes fixed themselves on the bonnet of Rosalind, which, besides being large, had the abomination of sundry bows, not to mention a bunch of laburnum blossoms. "Ah, my dear Miss Helen, the time will come, I will supplicate that it may, when you too, like your precious sister, shall become a sign and example to all men. How the seed grows, my sweet Miss Fanny!" she continued, turning to the only one of her guests whom, strictly speaking, she considered it right to converse with. "How it grows and spreads under the dew of faith and the sunshine of righteousness! It is just 3 months, 3 little blessed months, since the beam first fell upon my heart, Miss Fanny. And look at me, look at my child, look at my albums, look at my books, look at my card racks, look at my missionary's box on one side, and my London Lord Day Society box on the other. Is not this a ripening and preparing for the harvest, Miss Fanny?" Fanny coloured, partly perhaps from pride and pleasure, but partly certainly from shyness at being so distinguished, and only murmured the word "beautiful" in reply. Miss Mowbray felt equally provoked and disgusted, but while inwardly resolving that she would never again put herself in the way of witnessing what she so greatly condemned, she deemed it best to stay, if possible, the torrent of nonsense which was thus overwhelming her sister, by giving another turn to the conversation. "Have you seen Mrs. Richards lately, Mrs. Simpson?" she said. "Mrs. Richards and I very rarely meet now, Miss Mowbray," was the reply. "The 3 young ladies, indeed, I am happy to say, have wholly separated themselves from their mother in spirit, and are all of them becoming shining lights. Oh, Miss Fanny, how sweetly pious are those lines written between you and little Mary!" Fanny suddenly became red as scarlet. "The alternate verses, I mean, in praise and glory of our excellent minister. He brought them to me himself, and we read them together, and we almost shed tears of tender blessing on you both, dear children." Charles, who thought, and with great satisfaction, that whatever stuff his poor little sister might have written, she was now very heartily ashamed of it, wishing to relieve her from the embarrassment which nevertheless he rejoiced to see, rose from his chair, and approaching a window, said, "What a very pleasant room you have here, Mrs. Simpson! It is almost due east, is it not? If the room over it be your apartment, I should think the sun must pay you too early a visit there, unless your windows are well curtained." "Oh, Mr. Mowbray, sunrise is such a time of praise and blessing that, even though the curtains are drawn, I always try, if I am awake, to think how heavenly it is looking outside." "Are you an early riser, Mrs. Simpson?" said Helen. "Not very, at least not always; but since my election I have been endeavouring to get down to prayers by about 8:30. It is so delightful to think how many people are coming downstairs to prayers just at 8:30. "Your little girl is very much grown, Mrs. Simpson," said Miss Torrington, willing to try another opening by which to escape from under the heels of the lady's hobby, but it did not answer. "Hold your head up, Mimima dear," said the mamma, "and tell these ladies what you have been learning lately. She is still rather shy, but it is going off, I hope. Precious child, she has grown such a prayerful thing. Miss Fanny, you can't imagine. Mimima, why did you not eat up all your currant pudding yesterday? Tell Miss Fanny Mowbray." "Because it is wicked to love currant pudding," answered the child, folding her little hands one over the other upon the bosom of her plain frock, no longer protruding in all directions its sumptuous chevaux de frise of lace and embroidery. "Darling angel! And why, my precious, is it wicked?" because it is a sin to care for all vile bodies, and because we ought to love nothing but the Lord." "Is not that a blessing?" said Mrs. Simpson, again turning to Fanny. "And how can I be grateful enough to the angelic man who has put me and my little one in the right way?" It was really generous in good Mrs. Simpson to give all the praise due for the instruction and religious awakenings of her little girl to the vicar, for it was in truth entirely her own work, as it generally happened, that when Mr. Cartwright paid her a visit, fearing probably that the movements of a child might disturb his nerves, she dismissed her little Mimima to her nursery. One or two more attempts on the part of Helen to bring the conversation to a tone that she should consider as more befitting the neighbourly chit-chat of a morning visit, and, in plain English, less tinctured with blasphemy, having been made and failed, she rose and took her leave, the rest of her party following, but not without Fanny's receiving another embrace, and this fervent farewell uttered in her ear: "The saints and angels bless and keep you, dear sister." After quitting the house of this regenerated lady, the party proposed to make a visit to that of Mrs. Richards, but Miss Cartwright expressed a wish to go to the vicarage instead, and begged they would call at the door for her as they passed. Miss Torrington offered to accompany her, but this was declined, though not quite in her usual cynical manner upon such occasions; and could Rosalind have followed her with her eye up the vicarage hill, she would have seen that she stopped and turned to look down upon the common and its trees, just at the spot where they had stood together before. On entering Mrs. Richards' pretty flower-scented little saloon, they were startled and somewhat embarrassed at finding that lady in tears, and Major Dalrymple walking about the room with very evident symptoms of discomposure. Helen, who, like everybody else in the neighbourhood, was perfectly aware of the Major's unrequited attachment, or at any rate his unsuccessful suit, really thought that the present moment was probably intended by him to decide his fate for ever, and felt exceedingly distressed at having intruded, though doubtful whether to retreat now would not make matters worse. Those who followed her shared both her fears and her doubts, but not so the widow and the Major, who both, after the interval of a moment, during which Mrs. Richards wiped her eyes and Major Dalrymple recovered his composure, declared with very evident sincerity that they were heartily glad to see them. "We are in the midst of a dispute, Mowbray," said the Major, addressing Charles, "and I will bet 1,000 to 1 that you will be on my side, whatever the ladies may be. Shall I refer the question to Charles Mowbray, Mrs. Richards?" "Oh yes, I should like to have it referred to the whole party," she replied. "Well then, this it is. I need not tell you, good people, that the present Vicar of Wrexhill is but haute la!" he exclaimed, suddenly stopping himself and fixing his eyes on Fanny. "I am terribly afraid, by the trim cut of that little bonnet, that there's one amongst us that will be taking notes. Is it so, Miss Fanny? Are you as completely over head and ears in love with the vicar as your friend little Mary? And for that matter, Louisa, Charlotte, Mrs. Simpson, Miss Mimima Simpson, Dame Rogers, the miller's wife, black-eyed Betsy, the tailor's daughter, Molly Tomkins, Sally Findon, Jenny Curtis, Susan Smith, and about 70 more of our parish, have all put on the armour of righteousness, being buckled, belted, and spurred by the vicar himself. Are you really and truly become one of his babes of grace, Fanny?" "If it is your intention to say anything disrespectful of Mr. Cartwright," replied Fanny, "I had much rather not hear it. I will go and look at your roses, Mrs. Richards." And as Mrs. Richards did not wish her to remain, she quietly opened the glass door which led into the garden, let her pass through it, and then closed it after her. "Pretty creature!" exclaimed Major Dalrymple. "What a pity!" "It will not last, Major," said Charles. "He has scared her conscience, which is actually too pure and innocent to know the sound of its own voice, and then he seized upon her fanciful and poetic imagination, and set it in arms against her silly self, till she really seems to see the 7 mortal sins turn which way she will, and I am sure she would stand for 7 years together on one leg, like an Hindu, to avoid them. She is a dear good little soul, and she will get the better of all this trash, depend upon it." "I trust she will, Mowbray. But tell me, while the mischief is still at work, shall you not think it right to banish the causer of it from your house? For you must know this brings us exactly to the point at issue between Mrs. Richards and me. She is breaking her heart because her 3 girls, I, little Mary and all, have been bit by this black tarantula, and because she, thank heaven, has escaped. Her daughters have thought proper to raise the standard of rebellion, and to tell her very coolly upon all occasions that she is doomed to everlasting perdition, and that their only chance of escape is never more to give obedience or even attention to any word she can utter." The Major stopped, overcome by his own vehemence, and Charles would have fancied that he saw tears in his eyes if he had dared to look at him for another moment. Rosalind, who had more love and liking for Mrs. Richards than is usually the growth of 6 months' acquaintance, had placed herself close beside her and taken her hand. But when Major Dalrymple ceased speaking, she rose up, and with a degree of energy that probably surprised all her hearers, but most especially Charles and Helen, she said, "If Major Dalrymple, You should be the first in this unfortunate parish of Wrexhill to raise your voice against this invader of the station, rights, and duties of a set of men in whose avocations he has neither part nor lot. You will deserve more honour than even the field of Waterloo could give you. Yes, turn him from your house, dear friend, as you would one who had brought poison to you in the guise of wholesome food or healing medicine. Let him never enter your doors again. Let him preach, if preach he must, in a church as empty as his own pretensions to holiness, and if proper authority should at length be awakened to chase him from a pulpit that belongs of right to a true and real member of the English Church, then let him buy a sixpenny licence, if he can get it, to preach in a tub, the only fitting theatre for his doctrines." "Bravo!" cried the Major in perfect ecstasy. "Do you hear her, Mrs. Richards? Charles Mowbray, do you hear her? And will either of you ever suffer Cartwright to enter your doors again?" "I believe in my heart that she is quite right," said Charles. "The idiot folly I have witnessed at Mrs. Simpson's this morning, and the much more grievous effects which his ministry, as he calls it, has produced here, have quite convinced me that such ministry is no jesting matter. But I have no doors, Dalrymple, to shut against him. All I can do is to endeavour to open my mother's eyes to the mischief he is doing." Helen sighed and shook her head. "Is then your good mother too far gone in this maudlin delirium to listen to him?" said the Major in an accent of deep concern. "Indeed, Major, I fear so," replied Helen. "I told you so, Major Dalrymple," said Mrs. Richards. "I told you that in such a line of conduct as you advise I should be supported by no one of any consequence, and I really do not feel courage to stand alone in it." "And it is that very want of courage that I deplore more than all the rest," replied the Major. "You that have done and suffered so much, with all the quiet courage of a real heroine, that you should now sink before such an enemy as this, is what I really cannot see with patience." "And whence comes this newborn cowardice, my dear Mrs. Richards?" said Rosalind. "I will tell you, Miss Torrington," replied the black-eyed widow, her voice trembling with emotion as she spoke. "I will tell you, all the courage of which I have ever given proof has been inspired, strengthened, and set in action by my children, by my love for them, and their love for me. This is over. I have lost their love. I have lost their confidence. They look upon me, even my Mary, who once shared every feeling of my heart, they all look upon me as one accursed, separated from them through all eternity, and doomed by a decree of my Maker, decided on thousands of years before I was born, to live for countless ages in torments unspeakable. They repeat all this, and hug the faith that teaches it. Is this not enough to sap the courage of the stoutest heart that ever woman boasted?" "It is dreadful!" cried Helen. "Oh, most dreadful! Such then will be, and already are, the feelings of my mother respecting me, respecting Charles. Yet how she loved us! A few short months ago, how dearly she loved us both!" "Come, come, Miss Mowbray, I did not mean to pain you in this manner," said the Major. "Do not fancy things worse than they really are. Depend upon it, your brother will take care to prevent this man's impious profanation of religion from doing such mischief at Mowbray as it has done here. Had there been any master of the house at Meadow Cottage, this gentleman, so miscalled reverend, would never, never, never have got a footing there." "Then I heartily wish there were," said Charles, "if only for the sake of setting a good example to the parish in general; but for the park in particular, it is as masterless as the cottage." "I believe," said Mrs. Richards, "that amongst you I shall gain courage to be mistress here, and this, if effectually done, may answer as well. You really advise me then, all of you, to forbid the clergymen of the parish from entering my doors?" "Yes," replied the Major firmly, and he was echoed zealously by the rest of the party. "So be it then," said Mrs. Richards. "But I would my enemy, for such indeed he is, held any other station among us. I could shut my doors against all the lords and ladies in the country with less pain than against the clergyman." "I can fully enter into that feeling," said Helen; "but surely, in proportion as the station is venerable, the abuse of it is unpardonable. Let this strengthen your resolution, and your children will recover their wits again. Depend upon it, I would the same remedy could be applied with us. But you are so much respected, my dear Mrs. Richards, that I am not without hope from your example. Adieu! We shall be anxious to hear how you go on, and you must not fail to let us see you soon." The Mowbray party, having recalled the self-banished Fanny, then took leave, not without the satisfaction of believing that their visit had been well timed and useful. CHAPTER IX.